I saw Lon Chaney Jr. walking with the Queen, doing the werewolves of London.
Even a man who's pure of heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright. Hello. In this video, as part of my Halloween 2021 series, we're going to be talking about George Waggner's 1941 film, The Wolfman. And I'm joined for this discussion by one of my favorite scholars, Dr. Kevin Wetmore. So first off, Kevin, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Kevin Wetmore is a professor of theater arts at Loyola Marymount University. He's the author of a dozen books, including Post-9/11 Horror in American Cinema, Eaters of the Dead, Myths and Realities of Cannibal Monsters, and the Devil's Advocates volume on The Conjuring. He's also the multi-Bram Stoker Award-nominated editor of over a dozen books, including The Streaming of Hill House, Uncovering Stranger Things, and the forthcoming The Many Lives of the Purge. He's contributed over 100 journal articles and book chapters on topics ranging from ghosts on the Japanese stage to eco-critical readings of the Avengers films to vampires in Shakespeare's plays. He's also an actor, director, and stage combat choreographer who lives and works in Los Angeles. And I'll add on my part that Kevin's books on African and African-American adaptations of Greek tragedies have been incredibly influential on my own scholarship. So his career is multifaceted, well more than that brief introduction gives him credit for.
You flatter me, sir. Thank you.
So I've got my wolf hat on. I've got my pumpkin spice coffee. I'm channeling Wolfman Jack.
Are you the Wolfman?
No, man, I'm not the Wolfman. The Wolfman is everywhere.
I think we're ready to talk about the Wolfman. So to start out, Kevin, can you just give us a brief plot summary of this film?
Sure. It's from 1941, one of the later Universal horror films. They've already gone through the whole Dracula, Frankenstein, Mummy cycles. And this one concerns young Lawrence Talbot, played by he's credited as Lon Chaney, but it's really Lon Chaney Jr. And Lon Chaney was sort of built Universal. Carl Laemmle, the head of Universal, loved Lon Chaney as an actor, wanted him to be the original Dracula. And so his son, Lon Chaney Jr., goes into the family business, playing Lawrence Talbot in The Wolfman. So in the film, Lawrence has been estranged from his family. They're located in Wales. They have an ancestral castle that 5 generations of Talbot have sort of lorded over the lands on. But he went to America, which explains why he comes back to Wales with an American accent. And he shows up, and his father's like, he shows up because his older brother has passed away. And so his father has informed him, you're now going to be the next, Lord Talbot. You kind of need to come home. So he's had this life in America for 2 decades. He returns, and he's ready to take over, and he's ready to be the sort of British aristocrat. But the Talbot estates are located in this Welsh village, which is vaguely 20th, vaguely 19th century. They clearly have electricity, but everyone uses oil lamps for some reason. And looking through a telescope, and something that today we would find, I think, deeply disturbing, he spies Gwen, the daughter of the local shopkeeper, in her bedroom. And so he goes into their antique shop and begins flirting with her, tells her what the things on her bedroom dresser. And she's like, well, how do you know all that? He becomes interested in her, and he's like, oh, maybe I'll stay here. This will be wonderful. And then a what they call a gypsy carnival shows up, and they're like, oh, they come through every year at this time. You can get your fortune told. It's a lot of fun. So he, displaying that he has no concept of no means no, he's like, I'm taking you out tonight. She's like, no, I have a fiance. He's like, I'll pick you up at 8. No. And at 8 o'clock, he rolls around and she goes with him. They go with a mutual friend to get their fortunes read by Bella, who is played by Bela Lugosi. But it turns out, spoiler alert, Bella's a werewolf. And when he looks in the palm of the young woman, he sees a pentagram, which is the sign that this is the next person to be attacked by the werewolf. So he tells her he foresees her death. She leaves in a panic. He transforms into a wolf and kills her and devours her partially. So they're like, oh, but in the meantime, Larry Talbot, who has bought a silver wolf-headed cane from Gwen as part of their meet cute, uses the silver wolf-headed cane to beat what he thinks is a wolf to death. the wolf that's attacking Jenny. And it turns out then, as soon as it dies, it turns back into Bella. And they're like, oh, turns out Lord Talbot's son killed one of the gypsies. Oops. But he insists it was a wolf. While he has beaten the wolf to death, however, he gets bitten. And instead, the bite mark on his chest heals instantly and becomes a pentagram tattoo, or a pentagram scar, rather. And so he begins having these strange dreams. And when the moon rises, even though he is pure in heart, he himself becomes a wolf and is deeply concerned and confused by the fact that there were animal footprints leading up to his bedroom window, and he finds himself in bed with 30 feet. And he begins to believe himself a werewolf. His father says, look, you're confused. You are attacked by a wolf. All these things are very strange. You're not losing your mind, and we're going to cure you of this. He ties him to a chair, and of course, Larry begins losing his mind. He asks Gwen to run away with him, even though she's engaged to the sort of gameskeep around the estate. She starts spending more time with Larry than she should. And the whole thing culminates with the Bella's mother, the gypsy woman, played by Maria Uspenskája, who's one of the original members of Stanislavski's company. This is an actress who appeared in Chekhov's plays at their world premieres. And now she's playing an old gypsy woman in this film, showing up again in the sequels. Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, House of Frankenstein. Maria's in there again. And she shows up and explains to Larry, now you are the wolf. And explains to Gwen, we must stop him. You must help him. He's going to be a wolf. And of course, he turns into a wolf. He attacks Gwen. She is then rescued by his father, who sees the difference is, and I realize it's a rather long plot summary. Whereas Bella became a dog, like he became a dog-like wolf, a wolf. Larry is not a werewolf. He is a wolf man, capital W, capital M, a hybrid of, or a male, a man, human, with wolf-like characteristics. He gets very curly hair and pointed ears and fangs and claws, and he walks on animal paws, but he is still very humanoid and not at all wolf-like. And so when his father is like, who is this guy? This is just weird. He begins to beat him with the same silver-headed cane. And as soon as he has killed this wolf-like thing that's attacking him, it transforms back into Larry as Maria's standing there saying, no, this is your son, and don't worry, he's at peace now. Then she gets in her wagon and runs away, and it basically ends with all of them standing there looking at the dead body of his son, going, well, now he has no heirs, but who knows what happened here? And immediately you begin to see sort of the revision happening where they say, oh, a wolf attacked Gwen, and Larry went to the rescue, and the wolf killed Larry, even though Larry was the wolf. So the film plays with a lot of different motifs in terms of belief, in terms of not just belief, folk belief, but also personal belief. Larry's running around going, I'm a werewolf. His father's like, nonsense. No Talbot has ever been an animal. Stop. So it has to do with belief. It has to do with the stories we tell ourselves. And it's also just a good old-fashioned universal horror film that were being written by people who were rather clever and would insert a whole lot of things that maybe the movie-going public at the time would not recognize. When you look at James Whale's Bride of Frankenstein, it's just a masterpiece, but deeply, deeply subversive. Wolfman less so. But you just asked for a synopsis of the plot, so let's stay with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. You've introduced actually a lot of the themes that I wanted us to talk about in this conversation. The first one being belief, and that particular, the folk aspect of belief in particular, because there's a lot of lore surrounding werewolves, and I'm interested in how closely this movie sort of sticks to existing werewolf legends, or if there's even a coherent body of werewolf legends.
There is after this film, ironically. Okay. So before this film, there's sort of different lycanthropic traditions, if you will. Like every culture has their own people who can turn into animals. In Africa, there are were hyenas and were jaguars. They're not called that, but just to use that language. Were meaning man, so werewolf is a man wolf. People can turn into jaguar, people can turn into hyenas. In Hawaii, you have were sharks, people who can turn into a shark. So the whole idea of the shapeshifter who becomes an animal is kind of universal. But in the case of the werewolf tradition, really comes out of medieval and Renaissance Europe. And you have these stories of historic werewolves, Peter Stubb, and none of them follow anything that you find in traditional folklore. They were given a wolf pelt belt by the devil, where they were given this salve that when they rub on their skin, they become wolves, and then they rub it off and they become human again. So it's becoming a wolf is always sort of a conscious choice, and there's some sort of magical mechanism by which it happens. And one of the predominant legends from this period is also that if you're a werewolf in life, you become a vampire after death. So the monstrous person who remains monstrous even after they die, we need to stake them and cut their head off. But that's kind of what's out there is oh yeah, there are people out there who can turn into wolves, but they have to do stuff. And this is the film that says actually lycanthropy is transmitted through a bite. And that becomes, that's belief now. That's, oh yeah, you become a werewolf when a werewolf bites you. And we see that in An American Werewolf in London, Ginger Snaps, The Howling, like all the great werewolf films of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s literally take almost all their cues from the Wolfman. The idea that the Wolfman is not a wolf per se, but a humanoid wolf-like thing, that werewolves are, bipedal instead of quadrupeds. Because when you look at like the Penny Dreadful Waggner the werewolf, he becomes a wolf. He's on all fours, he runs around, he's a wolf. It's the Wolfman that really sort of perpetuates the idea that you become a man-like wolf or a human-like wolf rather than full wolf. And that's kind of one of the fun things that An American Werewolf in London sort of reverses 40 years of this by saying, no, you become a giant wolf. Mm-hmm. So it seemed innovative at the time because it was going back to before the Wolfman. So a lot of the stuff that comes out, there are a lot of different ways to kill werewolves. Silver is traditionally associated with it, but you can also burn them and do enough bodily damage to a werewolf, it's going to die no matter what. And so the Wolfman is like, oh no, it has to be silver, but anything silver can end the werewolf. The idea of the full moon, that's really coming out of the Wolfman. Before that, when you read these historic accounts of historic werewolves, let me put that in quotes, they can turn into a wolf when they want, put on the belt, rub the salve on the body, say the right prayer to the devil, and boom, you're a wolf. Mm-hmm. It's really the Wolfman that says, no, it's linked to the cycles of the moon, and only under a full moon do you become a wolf. So the film itself, Kurt Siodmak, the screenwriter, really made up a lot of stuff that sounds really good and sounds very folklore. Yeah. So much so that it's become the folklore. Like we're like, oh yeah, that's what a werewolf is. But he kind of made a lot of that stuff up himself.
That's really fascinating. Mm-hmm. The other sort of element of belief that you had introduced there, which is related and definitely central to this film, is psychological belief. I mean, the film, it opens with an image of someone like opening a dictionary to the word lycanthropy. There's discussion of lycanthropy. There's repeated attempts from particularly Lord Talbot, but really kind of everybody in the film to be like, listen, Larry, you just think you're turning into a wolf because you're stressed. You just need to calm down and then you'll. So what's the role of psychology in this film? Because it's prevalent, but why is it so prevalent?
Well, I'm going to answer that by sort of going in through the back door, and that's Siodmak's original screenplay for this film never actually showed the Wolfman. It was sort of left up. His whole thing is you have no idea in the original script. It's really ambiguous. Does he really become a wolf, or does he just think he does and he's doing the murders himself? Like it's just Larry running out on the moors killing people. Yeah. And he thought this would be a really interesting film that we'd never actually see the monster, so it's up to the audience to decide if he's really a werewolf or if he's just mentally ill and a murderer. And he brought this to the studio, and the studio said, the audience expects to see a monster. If you're going to call a film The Wolfman, it's got to have a Wolfman in it. He's like, but isn't this interesting? And they said, you're a screenwriter, shut up, put a Wolfman in your Wolfman movie. And so what you see in the film with all that psychology is sort of the remains, if you will, of that first script, in which it really was a psychological exploration of the belief, if you think you're something, that old Kurt Vonnegut saw, be careful what you pretend to be, because that is what you are. That if Larry believes and pretends that he's a werewolf, then he is going to become that. And instead it's, nope, this is really a gypsy curse. This is really him becoming a wolf, but only for 3 nights a month. And so they give us that. But what remains from that first script in terms of the psychology then is this whole exploration Because one of the things that the films tried to do, sort of all the Universal films, is ground themselves in a believable science.
Mhm.
You know, when you look at The Mummy, when you look at Frankenstein, you're given scientific explanations of how these things are possible.
Absolutely.
So they're deeply Gothic, but they're also very much the product of sort of that beginning of the 20th century. We're living in a scientific decade. You know, it's always people with British accents. You know, Dr. Pretorius, or like, we are in a new realm of gods and monsters. We are beyond traditional religion now. The universe is open to us. So it's this whole notion of science. And you have the village doctor, who's also the Talbot family doctor, who comes in as like, you know, Sir John, your son is deeply disturbed. He believes he's a wolf. We need to get him out of the village. It's the environment that's doing this to him. He lived in America for, 20 years and didn't have any problems being back here in this small village under all these stressful conditions, the death of his brother. You guys haven't talked for 18 years and now he's back. And, he's in this weird love triangle thing going on, and there have been murders in front of him and he killed this guy. He is going crazy and needs to leave. And so I was like, nonsense. You'll see tonight, there's nothing, so it's that, it's not just about belief, it's about the war between belief and unbelief, or better yet, when two or three belief systems crash together. So you have, scientific rationalism from the doctor, the father, who is sort of traditional family values. He just needs to man up and go out, see that the wolf does not exist, and he's not a wolf. And if he gets through the night and we can bring a dead wolf in front of him, then he'll know, and that'll be fine. And then you have Larry, who's listening to Maria Uspensky going, oh yeah, I'm a wolf. I'm totally a wolf. I am. And the funny thing is, the film confirms he's right.
Yeah.
He is the wolf. So we see this. And again, this happens in other Universal films as well. The whole point of Dracula is that guy's a vampire. No, he isn't. And part of the problem for us, I think, in 2021 is we know Dracula's a vampire. Our culture is so infused with the vampire Dracula. The whole point of both the original novel and then the Balderston play that played on Broadway that eventually became the Universal film is Dracula's walking around having conversations with people. Have you met our neighbor, Count Dracula? He's very nice. And the whole point is discovering that this guy's actually a vampire.
Yeah.
So you lose that discovery because the second you say Dracula, now we go, oh, he's a vampire. Why are these people just letting a vampire hang out with them? It's that slow discovery, which happens in The Wolfman. And we're so used to these stories, we forget that that's one of the big things in Universal horror is we know there's going to be a monster. It's just this slow revelation of people figuring it out. And that's the fun for us, is we know we're just waiting for the other people to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, and that's such an interesting point, because that can also make watching these movies really, really odd. Like, I just rewatched Frankenstein the other day, and I'm like, these are Henry Frankenstein's family members who come to him in his lab where he's like, yeah, I've stitched together a bunch of corpses and I'm going to bring it to life. And they're just like, that seems fine.
We'll be down for lunch.
Well,
they're very blasé about it.
Yeah. I mean, I can't really imagine being in that scenario and just being like, yeah, bring your stitched together corpse man to life. I'll be having a drink over here in the corner, not worrying about how terribly wrong this is. Indeed. So that's an interesting point.
Well, the films, I would argue, are also very much products of their time. I mean, if you watch The Wolfman now, there are large parts of it that are very cringeworthy. His whole interactions with Gwen, the way the film presents women, the way the film presents the Roma, and for that matter, the last time I watched this a few years ago, when things were happening, I kept going, why? When he sort of comes in and he's like, oh, thank God you're here, Larry. The family needs you. Well, I just got back from America, Pop. I'm like, why? Why was he in America? Why are you doing all this? And why is this big, doughy, sort of somewhere out there in the Midwest, a hardware store is missing its manager, now showing up in the middle of Wales, just looking kind of clueless and like a big goof. And he walks into the antique store. He's like, I'm going on a date with you. And the woman's like, no. He's like, I'll pick you up at 8. No, I don't think so. See you then. And then he shows up and she's like, fine, I'll go with you. And every step of the way in 2019, the last time I watched it, why? Why is he doing that? No means no. Why is she going with him? She has a fiance. He's going to be there too. This is weird.
The gender dynamics here are a huge problem
for the narrative.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've just introduced a couple of things I do want us to talk about. The first one being this question of why is Lon Chaney Jr. so American? Like, it doesn't, like you say, it doesn't really make that much sense that he's Welsh, but he's been gone for 18 years. Now he's completely American and he's forgotten all of his hometown's folklore. That seems really central to everybody else's sort of worldview in this town. It's like, is that just an excuse to say, here's the werewolf legend, we're giving it to you through exposition? Or is there something more going on there?
There's several things going on. The first is the practical. Since Lon Chaney Sr. was the man who, was the original Universal monster. He's the Hunchback. He's the Phantom. He is, London After Midnight. He's the scary guy. And here's his son who's named after him. They don't even call him Lon Chaney Jr. They just say Lon Chaney. So there is this sense of, this is our star. And so we're going to build the movie around him. So he's American. We can have Claude Rains, originally the Invisible Man. He's already got his own sort of Universal propers. Claude Rains is Sir John Talbot, and he's doing the Welsh accent. And you have all these British day players who are coming in and doing the accent flawlessly and beautifully. And I'll give them credit for not making Lon Chaney do an accent, because he probably couldn't.
Very fair.
But the end result is what I like to call the Jean-Claude Van Damme situation. And why I appreciate it as a child of the 80s, they always tried to explain Arnold Schwarzenegger's accents they never tried to explain Arnold Schwarzenegger's accents in movies. Arnold just had an Austrian accent, and who cares? I grew up in Nebraska, and you're like, okay, that's fine. He has an accent, who cares? But in Jean-Claude Van Damme's films, they're always like, oh, he's Cajun. He's from Belgium. They always had to explain why he had a different accent than everyone else. And I think they're doing that here too with, he just spent 18 years in America. So that's why he sounds the way he does. To explain why it's Lon Chaney, this is the actor, we're going to have him play it, and we've said it in Wales, so this is why it's going to be the way it is. The problem, of course, being is, yes, moving to America doesn't give you amnesia or change the way that you have spoken for the first 20 years of your life.
No.
And there's still, I have friends who have lived, I live in Los Angeles, I have friends who have been in LA for 20, 30, 40 years from the UK, and they still have their accents. So unless it's a Rick Springfield situation where Lawrence Talbot went to America and worked very hard to remove his accent because he was going to go to Hollywood, except they didn't do that at that time. Instead, he comes home and his father's an amateur astronomer, and come fix the telescope. Larry's now an engineer, and he builds things and he makes things, and he's a man of science. The whole thing of the telescope, and we're going to look, but Larry turns the telescope around to look into women's bedrooms. Not at all creepy. So they try to explain, that's why he's American. He went to America, so that's why he's so American, even though he's originally from Wales. To the other part of your question, it's just silly then that he would forget everything about his village. I grew up in Connecticut. I haven't lived there in 30 years, but I still remember where everything is, the people I grew up with, the stories we told each other, and the stuff that happened there. I think that it's the script's loss that they didn't have him sort of rediscover things. It's really easy to just add a line or two of, the old wolf thing. He's like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. And then then you make it a conversation instead of just a monologue about, the gypsy comes in. It's amazing to me, this poem that Kurt, the screenwriter, made up gets repeated 5 times in the film. It's like anytime there's a full moon, they're like, time to say the wolf poem, just so we all remember.
I think it gets dropped 3 times within the first 10 minutes of it's like a 70-minute film.
Technically 69 and a half. It's not even 70 minutes.
Well, there you go.
3 times in the first 10 minutes, and then twice more when werewolf things happen during the last third.
Yeah.
But they just keep repeating that poem just to remind you. Here it is.
Yeah. It's super heavy-handed about everybody knows this folklore except Larry.
And there is something to be said then that Larry, who then becomes the wolf, sort of goes for a deep immersion within it. He forgot, and now he is the wolf. He's like, I think I'm a wolf. And everyone's like, oh, it's just a story.
Yeah.
But they're the ones who then begin denying. He forgot, they deny.
Yeah. So the other point that you you've brought up a couple of times is that we have these Roma characters. Again, the film calls them gypsies. They're in England, so they might be travelers, but they really look more like the sort of aesthetic, or they aesthetically are looking more like Eastern European Roma.
Yes.
The politics of how the Roma are represented have really changed very dramatically in the past few decades. Well after this film is made. So, like, what do we make of the role of the Roma characters here and the way that they're depicted?
Well, I find this film fascinating because the way they're introduced is we hear about them before we see them. And we're told, oh, the gypsies are coming. They come through every year at this time, and they set up camp in the forest outside the village, and we all go and have our fortunes told. So it's this sort of exciting thing that, oh, they've come and they're here, and this is like our fall carnival, and it's a lot of fun, and we all go. And, you know, seeing this even younger, I'm like, I don't buy that the whole village is really excited that these people are here. I mean, historically, you know, this is persecution time. This is people with torches going out and trying to drive them away. They're not welcome. So the film in some ways sort of whitewashes the way in which the Roma were treated, and instead presents it as this sort of annual event of these outsiders who come. And they're certainly othered. As you mentioned, they're dressed as Eastern European. Bela Lugosi is more or less Dracula with a mustache and gray hair. You know, he's Bela Blasco, his birth name is Hungarian, and he's sort of, they bring him in to be as Eastern European as you can, Bela. And again, Maria Uspenskaya is Russian. She's from the original Moscow Art Theater. And so the two of them have that sort of very thick Slavic accent, and they're certainly playing the characters as very, you know, the wolf is coming. Everything is said portentously and slowly with rolled R's and danger. So they're, even the performances are sort of othering these characters. They're in touch with the mysterious. They know things that the scientific Westerners don't.
Yeah.
So they're, you know, the film tries in some ways to give this sort of positive presentation. And of course, Maria Uspenskaya's character is the one who knows. She's the one who sort of provides, you need silver. And she even says, take this amulet to wear it to Larry. And Larry's like, I'm going to give it to Gwen. And in the end, it doesn't even protect Gwen. The Wolfman still attacks her, but for a while it keeps her, you know, it's supposed to keep him safe from the wolf, because they're like, this is a guy who's about to get bit, and he gives it up. So they have mysterious powers, but they're not scientific. They're rooted in folklore. And it's that sort of thing that kind of comes out of, if I can get super scholarly for a second, that Cambridge School of Anthropology of, well, you have advanced civilizations and primitive civilizations. And the Roma are sort of a primitive civilization that live within an advanced civilization. Yeah. And they are connected to this folk magic that we have lost touch with somehow, that has some kind of efficacy. And I'm sure we could explain it if we thought about it, but we don't need to. So they're, and as always in these films, whether it's Dracula or the Wolfman, you always have the ethnic other in the middle of this European enclave, whether it's the Roma or the Egyptians or the Eastern Europeans in Dracula. That you know, the ethnic other who are mysterious and brutish and have this strange knowledge, and who are sort of the way for the main character, the American, the British person, to get into this world and then be threatened by the monster that is from it. I mean, if you want to do the deep dive, it's always about the incursion of the foreign into the European. That Dracula is this ancient monster from Eastern Europe who is now in London. That Victor Frankenstein, or in the films, Henry Frankenstein, is this man of science who has now returned to his family's ancestral schloss to build these dead bodies among, and even something like The Bride of Frankenstein. The German peasants are sort of presented as very traditional. They're all wearing lederhosen and dirndls, and they're all dressed like it's Oktoberfest, and they're primitive and simple, as opposed to we Americans who are watching this with our fedoras and our very nice cars. There is this sort of, oh, that's silly and old. What's interesting to me about The Wolfman, not to drift too far away from your question, is that it is really the first film that presents an American character. That the characters in Dracula are British, the characters in Frankenstein are German, you have some American characters in The Mummy, but they're predominantly British. And this is an American coming to Europe. So it's, and also the second thing that separates The Wolfman is Dracula was a novel, then a stage play. Frankenstein was a novel, then a stage play. The Mummy was rooted in the discovery of King Tut's tomb and the following Egyptology craze that followed. The Wolfman is whole cloth from the screenwriter's imagination. He didn't, as I mentioned earlier, he's not using a lot of werewolf legend stuff. Instead, he's making stuff up and taking this folk creature and getting it closer to the universal monsters.
Yeah.
So that what follows then is just a whole bunch of mashups. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, House of Dracula, House of Frankenstein, and then eventually Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, Abbott and Costello, it devolves into Monster Fest and then devolves even further into comedy.
Yeah. So
one last bit of trivia. One last bit of trivia. The only person who played the same character through all of the films is Lon Chaney. No one else ever played the Wolfman. All right, Boris Karloff is famous as Frankenstein, but in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, Frankenstein's monster is played by Bela Lugosi. Mm-hmm. Larry Talbot was always played by Lon Chaney. He's the only person who always played his universal monster. All the others, regardless of who they were played by multiple actors. So, and Talbot himself was rather proud of it and sort of famous for it. He kept bragging about it. Not like Talbot, I just called him by his character's name. Chaney was like, "I'm the Wolfman, man. No one else is the Wolfman." He's so identified with the character.
It's on his business cards.
Probably. If he had a website, he would be, Lon, the Wolfman, Chaney.
Yeah. So I think that's really important, all of the things that you had just said. One of the things that I think is one scene that I think is particularly worth noting in terms of the depiction of the Roma as the other, after Bella is killed, and Maria goes into the church with his body, the Anglican minister is like, "You guys can't have this crazy gypsy funeral where people are going to be dancing and singing and celebrating and stuff. Everyone has to be sad. Otherwise, it's Satan." Yeah. And he literally, Maria has a line, I couldn't change the tradition even if I wanted to. And the Anglican minister says something like, fighting against primitive superstition is as difficult as fighting the devil, or something like this. So, I mean, there really is just that overt, these people are somehow wicked and wrong and primitive, even though they actually understand how the werewolf works and all of our psychobabble is wrong.
Very much so. And it's interesting because I always parallel that scene with a scene several minutes later where Larry Talbot walks into the church and his father's like, "Come, Larry, sit." And instead, Larry just looks around and walks out and puts his hat back on and just leaves.
Yeah.
And it's this notion of, now that he has been touched by the curse, he is no longer welcome in sort of this very stern Anglican environment. He's no longer comfortable there. Now that he has moved through the Roma world, he is becoming othered himself.
Yeah.
And the irony of the film is psychology doesn't help him, medicine doesn't help him. He has become a werewolf. So you could read it on one level as everyone was fine until these people showed up, and it is they who sort of bring the reality of the supernatural in. And I appreciate the irony of the minister's statement, because it's, trying to fight your primitive superstition is as difficult as trying to fight my primitive superstition. Yeah. It's the devil, and you're like, well, dude, that's ironic, right? You're being silly. So again, less enlightened times, 1941, and again, I always like to look at films in context. We can talk about transhistoricity and how they matter now, but looking at an Anglo-American co-production by Universal that is about England when the war is already raging in Europe and America is sitting out. And now here's this American who shows up in Europe and gets involved in all of these crazy things. This film was released and Pearl Harbor happens, I think, 4 or 5 months later. So when this film comes out, we're still staying out of it. I mean, we're looking at Europe going, those people are crazy. So that might also be one reason why the emphasis is on Larry as an American and Larry as an innocent. Is this is what happens when we get over there. is this crazy infighting, and it's not just the Welsh and the British who we like, but there's also these other people who will add in all these other elements, and it's never easy. And then, so it wasn't until we were attacked that we're like, okay, now we'll get involved.
Yeah,
I think that's an important hint of that hiding in the film.
Yeah. So the other thing that I wanted to come back to, in terms of the way that the Roma are presented, and this idea of like folk knowledge and protection against magic, is the pendant. I mean, and you brought this up earlier, but we have almost an exactly identical thing that happens in The Mummy, where the young, attractive male lead is given a pendant that will protect him from Ardeth Bey's magic. He puts it on, I forget what the female character's name is, Noxunamun reincarnated. He puts it on her door to try and protect her, and that allows Ardeth Bey to basically like strangle him from a distance. Here, Larry is given this pendant that's supposed to prevent him from turning into the werewolf. He gives it to Gwen, despite the fact that he was specifically told not to do that. And then he turns into the Wolfman and he attacks her. So, like, there's I think a really important role for things like pendants and charms in these classic horror movies. But like, why are these so important?
Well, partly, I mean, it's a trope that's been since the beginning of cinema. If you go back to the original Nosferatu, when Hooter shows up, in the village and is like, "I'm going to see Count Orlok," they're like, "You need this," and they hand him a book on vampires, and he starts reading it. And he laughs, and they're like, "Take it with you. You need this information." He's like, "Nope, I'm good." So and then virtually every film after that, we will have the hero, whoever it is, encounters the other who knows what's really going on. There's this horrible monster here. You're in a strange territory now. And that's certainly, the two great plots are Stranger in a Strange Land or A Stranger Comes to Town. And so with the first half of Dracula, it's Stranger in a Strange Land. Guy goes to Transylvania. Second half is A Stranger Among Us. Dracula then comes to London. So we're seeing that in Nosferatu. We see it in The Mummy. We see it in The Wolfman. This notion of the thing, the prop, the item of power in a form of sympathetic magic. This will protect you against the thing. And then, of course, the first thing the person does is give it away or give it up. On the one hand, as you point out, on the one hand, it's a very simple plot device. Here's a way to stop the thing. Oh, and they gave it up. That heightens the tension. As in terms of writing, it's very effective because we keep going, put it on, put it back on. What are you doing? It's Hitchcock's spring bomb theory, in that we know the wolf is going to come if you're not wearing it. Take it off, because now the tension's there. Now it's, in terms of creating horror, it's a very effective device. But again, as I mentioned earlier with the Cambridge School of Anthropology, I think we're also looking at a Hollywood that is fascinated with the idea of fetishes and other cultures that imbue objects with power, not seeing how we do the same thing. The inability to perceive it in your own culture, but looking at others and going, oh yeah, the idea of this, the medallion that will save you, the medallion that will keep the bad guy away. Yeah. Because it's also all about the material culture, and film is a visual medium. So I can say this prayer and you'll be fine, because film is visual. I need something that I can see you're wearing or not wearing it. In fact, the first film that I can think of that does that, and only does it comedically, is Army of Darkness, where I said, go get the Book of the Dead, again, an object of power, but make sure you say the words Klaatu Verada Nikto before you take it. Otherwise, it'll turn evil. And of course, Bruce Campbell's character cannot remember the incantation accurately. It's like Klaatu Verada Necktie, Klaatu Verada. And it's comic because he can't remember the words. Yeah. But then the visuals follow. So I think partly it's also in terms of screenwriting and in terms of how film works. You tie that to culturally the idea of the object of power, this thing that can stop the bad guy. And we see, it becomes shorthand in monster fighting anyway, because monsters are sort of their own class of thing. If I were to say to you, what kills a vampire?
Garlic, stake through the heart.
Exactly.
Sunlight. Yeah.
What kills a werewolf?
Silver bullets generally, but any
What
silver according to...
What does Frankenstein's monster hate?
fire.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a person in America that would not pass that test with 100%. Because, okay, now we know these things work. So with Dracula, we get a stake. So it's sort of, in terms of screenwriting 101, you have the failed object of power and then the successful object of power. This didn't work. He became a werewolf. So now let's go get that silver-headed wolf cane.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we imbue things. I think that's there as well. The funny thing is, in the novel Dracula, when I teach this course, or when I teach my courses in horror, we talk about Dracula, and I know who's read it because I'm like, how does Dracula die? And when they say stake through the heart, okay, you've seen the movie, you haven't read the novel. Because in the novel, there's no stake anywhere near Dracula. Sorry, spoiler alert. His head is cut off with a Bowie knife. That's how he dies in the novel. And then his mouth is filled with communion wafers and his body disintegrates. And it's because one of the people pursuing him is a Texan, which we also kind of leave out, except in the very weird Francis Ford Coppola movie where they thought, we need Keanu Reeves in this movie. But oddly not playing the Texan. So
I was going to say, I don't really think of Texas and Keanu as quite going hand in glove there, but...
Fair enough. But also, killing a vampire with a Bowie knife, that doesn't work. You need, with monsters, and with for every monster you have to have a monster hunter. You have to have a thing that stops the monster. And the danger, if we want to go full Nietzsche here, is once you start fighting monsters, you can become a monster, and that is literally the plot of the Wolfman. Larry fights a monster, Larry becomes a monster, and his father then has to kill him in the same exact way with the same exact implement. There are no silver bullets in this one. There's only a silver wolf-headed cane. But the idea of a silver bullet becomes so endemic after this that it has to be silver and we can shoot him with a bullet. And you literally have a film based on Stephen King's Cycle of the Werewolf that they just retitled Silver Bullet. That's how you kill werewolves, not just silver bullets.
Yeah. Well, of course, it's easier to be a good distance away and shoot something with a silver bullet than it is to get up close and
fair enough.
beat a
That
werewolf
was Larry's
to death.
mistake. If Larry had a gun with silver bullets, he wouldn't have gotten bitten. So the cane is, perhaps the second best weapon. And that's sort of the other thing that I sort of chuckle at the end of the film is when the father's hitting Larry with the cane, Larry in wolf form bites neither Gwen nor his father. And so we can see him as sort of kind of heroic, trying not to pass the curse on, but doing everything he needs to do to just sort of be killed. And yet at the same time, with that 69-minute runtime, the film doesn't really develop what it's like to be a werewolf at all. It's just Larry freaks out. He then has these wonderful Jack Pierce transformations with yak hair, and then they kill him.
Yeah.
So it's effective as a 1941 horror film. I think it's more effective in terms of its children and grandchildren, the cinematic spawn of the Wolfman that eventually we end up with. American Werewolf in London and The Howling and Dog Soldiers, and Ginger Snaps, just brilliant werewolf films that really sort of explore the mythos of a werewolf that the Wolfman did not do. Teen Wolf, indeed.
I think we'll leave it with Teen Wolf.
That's a good place to stop.
The most horrific of the werewolf movies.
Fair enough.
Again, thank you for taking the time to talk to me. This has been really fascinating.
It's been a pleasure, Philip. Good seeing you again, sir.